The long Pythagoric tradition in Western music. The history of Western music is intertwined with the history of the West itself. In the Western music history books with their most authoritative authors, this history has its beginnings in ancient Greece. But the classical period, 5th and 4th centuries B.C., of this culture exercised considerable relevance in the formation of the concepts of musical making in the West. A crucial demarcating point in this process was the well-known Pythagorean school. For some authors of historiography, the existence of the founder of this school, Pitagoras of Samos, is true. And within the history of philosophy, he stands as a pre-Socratic, but for other historiographers, the existence of Pythagoras is doubtful. However, Pythagorism as a philosophical school exerted great weight in the Western thought, particularly in music, regardless of the existence or not of the philosopher from Samos. It is important to note that within the history of mathematics Pythagoras is found as an important character for this science. However, within the history of philosophy he is found as a creator of a mystical sect attributed to mathematics. In the work Pythagoras and the Theme of Number, the author Mario Ferreira dos Santos wrote, "The construction of the true thought of Pythagoras is a work of exegesis and implies steps that would not fit within the scope of a synopsis of the history of philosophy. For the Pitagoras, numbers are the essence of all things, and mathematics becomes the science of the universe." In music, the presence of Pythagorean thought was fundamental to the founding concepts of this practice that in the West developed as art. But, for this school of Samos, its master and his disciples considered it as a science, although music in the West has developed with three basic aspects. With religious purposes mainly from the Christian era between the 4th and 6th centuries already with the Catholic Church. With a playful or festive purpose, and directed toward love, this one is a fruit of the culture of Western European civilization. However, for the ancient Greeks, music had healing purposes, as for Plato, for example, who is post-Pythagorean, and in his work The Republic, the dialogues narrated between Socrates, his master, and the philosopher-musician Glaucus demonstrate the outline of an aesthetic treatise on music and a theory of affections that goes beyond its Pythagorean principles. Although without losing sight of the rational principles of music proposed by the Pythagorean school, therefore, the legacy of Pythagoreanism in Western culture is very intense. Its numerous disciples over the centuries make clear this influence in musical thought and in the treatises on music that have developed over the centuries. Fact, however, that in the Greece of Pythagoras there was not only his philosophical school, other schools cohabited that culture. As the Brazilian philosopher Mario Ferreira dos Santos reminds us, the Pythagorean doctrines are a mixture of science and religious beliefs. Re-existence, immortality, transmigration of souls, kinship of the living, cycle of things, eternal return of events that have already happened, soul as the principle of movement, the living universe, the concept of cosmos, the universal order, and harmony between opposites. Numbers as the essence of everything and all things, because without them it would not be possible to know things, the mutability of numbers and the immutability of the one. Mario Ferreira reminds us that there is a clear influence of Pythagoreanism in modern sciences whose atomic theories end up having a purely mathematical notion of subatomic energy. Only that which is spatialized, and therefore numerable, is comprehensible to reason. Before we follow this Pythagorean trajectory, it is necessary to make a counterpoint analysis. We must keep in mind that the teachings of the Pythagorean school, which place music as a branch of study within mathematics, are older than the West itself. According to traditional historiography, Pythagoras had studied in Egypt and received his teachings there. Since ancient times, in distant human cultures, certain knowledge was part of the traditional perennialist philosophy that already considered music and its vibrational properties as a principiological metaphysics of the cosmos. That is, they attributed the existence of everything and all things to the cosmic vibratory processes, as formers of the matter of the universe, and did not attribute it exclusively to mathematics as the science of the cosmos, as the Pythagoreans understood it. According to contemporary ethnomathematicians, mathematics is an ancient practice among humans that must go back more than 20,000 years, although there are controversies regarding the dating. But the practice of mathematics among humans is not homogeneous, on the contrary, it is a practice with diversities of concepts. But, the mathematics that has predominated in the West in the last centuries is that of René Descartes by great influence of Pythagorism. In another way, hypothetically, it would be enough if the West did not have the Pythagorean influence, and remained in its metaphysical conceptions of any other philosophical school that did not have as a principle the physical material character of the elements. And in this perspective our modern sciences would not exist and our concepts and conceptions would be different. It is important to remember that from at least St. Augustine in the 4th century of the Christian era until the Renaissance of the 14th or 15th century, this entire medieval era, for some historians, is a period of Aristotelian inclination in the metaphysical sense. And the philosophy that predominated in the West was that of the scholasticism led by the Catholic Church, whose musical making was also largely guided by this religious institution until the ties are broken by the Renaissance. This influence of the physical material Pythagorean thought was fundamental for the construction of Western thought, although, as mentioned above, during the entire Middle Ages, the preponderance of the abstract and the metaphysical was predominant, thus leaving Pythagoreanism and mathematics somewhat extinguished, being resurrected only in the Renaissance when a new epistemology of culture, knowledge, and thought emerged. So new paradigms build the new world. The disciples of the Pythagorean tradition in Western music over the centuries. In the classical Greek period, between the 6th and 1st centuries, some of the greatest disciples of Pythagoreanism appear, concerned with the issues of music as a science, as a physical phenomenon based on acoustics, its relations with sacred geometry, and many other aspects. Philolaus of Crotona, who was one of the most important Pythagorean philosophers for having written a work with the teachings of this school to the point of influencing Plato. Plato is one of the most famous and influential philosophers of the West. He studied several areas of human knowledge and had in music one of his main objects of study. Taranto-Architz founded mathematical mechanics and influenced Euclid. He was the first to use the cube in geometry and to restrict mathematics to technical disciplines such as geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and acoustics. His central concern was mathematics and music. Aristoteles is, along with Plato, one of the best known and most studied philosophers of the West. He wrote several works, and in his work, Politica questions the participation of music in education, emphasizing that the teaching of music should have an emphasis on listening. His work Problems constitutes one of the oldest discussions about music. In it he raises questions concerning acoustics, scales, intervals, voice, strings, harmonics, types of composition, etc. Aristoxeno of Taranto learned music from his father, studied with Xenophilus, who was also a Pythagorean from whom he learned musical theory. His writings followed the Aristotelian style, focusing on philosophy, ethics, and music. Most of his writings have been lost, but the musical treatise, Elementa Harmonica, has survived incomplete, and some fragments on rhythm and metrics. This work by Aristoxenus is one of the main sources for what was Greek music theory. Between the 1st and 8th centuries of the Christian era, several other authors influenced by Pythagorism, both in music as in other sectors of human activities, contributed to the formation of Western thought, such as Caio Plinius II, born in the 1st century of the Christian era. He became known as Plinius the Elder. He wrote a vast work in several areas of knowledge, leaving an important legacy for later sciences. Nicomaco of Gerasa, he lived from the 60s to the 120s. He was a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher and Greco-Roman mathematician who made important contributions to mathematics and music. His work Enchiridion Harmonices, Handbook of Harmony, On the Pythagorean theory of music and the Theologomena Arithmetics, Theology of Numbers, in 2 volumes on the mystical properties of numbers. Only fragments of the latter survive. His works are among those that provided the basis for the later studies of so many other authors who helped build Western thought. Theon of Smyrna, born in the 1st century, he developed a work that is a compilation of knowledge prior to him, strongly influenced by Pythagoreanism. His work is divided into parts, with a main focus on mathematics and music. One section on numbers, and another on music and harmony. The music of numbers, instrumental music, and the music of the spheres. It is a treatise on temperament and harmony, the use of ratios, proportions and their meaning. The instrumental music sections do not deal with melody, but with intervals and consonances according to the work of Pythagoras. Another of Theon's works is devoted to astronomy. Claudio Ptolemy, better known as Ptolemy, was a Greek scientist who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, around 85 and 165. He developed works in mathematics, astronomy, geography, cartography, optics, and music theory. In his time, the studies of astronomy and astrology mixed science with mysticism. He wrote Harmonicorum Libri Trace, Theory of Sound, a treatise on the mathematical theory of music. In this treatise he wrote about how musical notes can be translated into mathematical equations and vice versa. Santo Agostinho. St. Augustine lived between the 4th and 5th centuries and was one of the most important thinkers of the first period of the Catholic Church in the West. In his extensive writings, he left a literary philosophical legacy that markedly influenced Western thought. In the work Trivium and Quadrivium, which is a collection of authors, in the chapter on music, Gerardo V. Hussaby writes, St. Augustine in his treatise De Musica developed in minute detail that dualistic perception that sought to reconcile the almost mystical concept of music as a theoretical science, which stems from the rationalism of the Pythagorean abstractions based on number, with the Aristotelian idea of music as an imitation of the passions and object of sensitive pleasure. The 2 conceptions of Greek origin that constitute this dichotomy, integrated into Christian thought, continued in full force throughout the Western Middle Ages, and persisted in some later authors. The quadrivium, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy and music, and the trivium, rhetoric, dialectic, grammar, formed the 7 liberal arts that were systematized during the Middle Ages and were a mainstay in the intellectual formation of the West. Other Pythagorean authors of this period between the 1st and 8th centuries were also important, such as Censorinus, St. Athanasius, Athanasius of Alexandria, Aristides Quintilian, Chalcidius, Ambrose Theodosius Macrobius, Proclo Lysius, known as Proclo Diadochus. But it was Boetius or Boethius, whose real name was Anisciu Manlio Torquato Severino Boethius, who wrote one of the main works in the history of musical treatises, entitled De Institutione Harmonica, which served as the basis for many authors until the recent period in the history of Western music. Many authors from the Middle Ages contributed to the continuity of Pythagorean thought. Also within Europe, influential authors wrote important works on music and other areas. Aurelianus of Riom, Aurelianus Riomensis, born in France, he lived during the 9th century. Benedictine monk, writer, and music theorist. He is the author of Music Discipline, which is the oldest preserved treatise on medieval music from the European Middle Ages. His treatise Music Discipline is the first written about music in medieval Europe in any language since classical antiquity. Only St. Isidore of Seville wrote about music before Aureliano, and it dealt with the music of antiquity. This work by Aurelian is the first to address simple chant, in the period immediately following the standardization of Gregorian chant in Northern and Western Europe. Gregorian chant or chant was created in the 6th century by Pope Gregory and became the main musical basis of the West. In this work of Aurelian musical discipline, we find the first preserved sample of musical notation. Johannes Scotus Erigen, Irish, lived in the 9th century, was a theologian and wrote a number of works, best known for having written De Division Naturae. Reginon of Prüm, born in Germany, he lived between the 9th and 10th century, was a Benedictine abbot, medieval chronicler, canonist, music theorist, and musicologist. Regino's earliest known work is the Epistola de Harmonica Institutionale, a treatise on music that he wrote in the form of a letter to Archbishop Ratbod. His main aim was to improve singing in the churches of the diocese and probably to secure Ratbod's support in this matter. He also wrote the Tonarius, a collection of songs. Jacques de Liège was a French musicologist of the 14th century. He is credited with authoring one of the most important music treatises of his time, the Speculum Musicae, which was written as a reaction against the innovations of the Ars Nova. Some authors outside the Western European axis also contributed to perpetuate the Pythagorean thought. Hunayn ibn Ishaq al-Ibadi lived in the 9th century. He was a writer, scholar, scientist, translator. Al-Hasan al-Khatib lived in the 11th century, was a philosopher of music and Sufi saint of Egypt. He learned the knowledge of Sufism from Rudbari. He is widely known for his book Kamal Adab al-Ghina, The Perfection of Musical Knowledge. Isaac ibn Latif, he was a Jewish philosopher who lived in the 13th century and created several works influenced by Neoplatonism. Pythagorean authors between the 15th and 19th centuries, periods of the Renaissance, Baroque, Romanticism in music. Before going into the Pythagorean authors of this long period that spans from the Renaissance of the 15th century to the Romanticism of the 19th century, it is important to point out that in the West, from the Renaissance on, particularly from the 14th century on, new cultural paradigms begin to emerge, new concepts of the world emerge and flow into the scientific revolutions of the 16th and 18th centuries, whose revolutions were definitive for the concepts of musical treatises in general. The French and North American political revolutions of the 18th century, as well as the Industrial Revolution that, step by step, allied itself to science, all mark a new epistemological period that can only be understood in the light of a profound study on the subject. In the 18th century, the emergence of political economy as a science starts to determine a new worldview of which the West becomes an unconditional hostage of a philosophy of life that humanity had never experienced before. In the industrial capitalism born out of this new reality, music, in this perspective, breaks away from the quadrivium, that is, from the liberal arts, the arts that allowed the intellectual emancipation of the individual, to belong to the branch of the servile arts. But, without this being officially described, since music passes from being a math science in its Pythagorean tradition to serve now a nascent economic reality that in its march conditions man to automation. It is a fact, however, that at least since the 12th century, European minstrels were already serving in some way the wealthier classes, many of whom depended on patrons. However, music from the Renaissance on will now follow in the footsteps of this culture, the form of composition changes, new aesthetic concepts are presented, polyphony and counterpoint, little by little during the Baroque period, will give way to the homophony of our days. And a new musical discourse is being born with scientific justifications, and an adaptation of the Pythagorean thought also tries to justify itself within a mathematical perspective, trying to fulfill its tradition. But from an industrial reality now imposed, that will be the fake, that is, the concept of fake becomes a norm within the industrial paradigms that will little by little replace what was once organic by now manufactured products, and music will inexorably follow the same path. When music reaches the 20th century, it no longer meets the basic elements of its tradition, and an emptying, or bankruptcy, of the elements that had sustained it can be observed, as they are now no longer as important as they once were. However, the arithmetic principles of musical rhythm and the mathematical principles of the scale and chords are still sustained as justifications of the musical system itself, presented in its theorization, a fact that in a certain way the presence of Pythagorean concepts are still in force, thus justifying its long tradition. In these historical steps, Western music from the Renaissance on has undergone considerable changes in terms of its aesthetic concepts. First, one of the most striking facts was that polyphony gradually gave way to homophony, thus abandoning the aesthetic concept that made several simultaneous voices prevail without the predominance of a main voice. In homophony, it is exactly this single main voice that will play the role of melody exclusively. Such transition takes place in a historical period that spans the entire Baroque between 1600 and 1750, culminating in the Classicism between 1750 and 1810-30, which makes prevail this new perspective of composition, a single melody being accompanied by a harmony. Melody as a monodic condition is very old in the West, since at least the 6th century, with the Gregorian chant, however, always practiced in group. Then, from the new provisions of the aesthetic planning of musical composition, in this new perspective, comes the pop singer of our days. All the idol singers, or even virtuoso musicians with individual careers, that have emerged in the last centuries, could only exist as celebrities, from the moment when homophony appeared, which makes a single melody with chordal accompaniment prevail. The incentive for this new musical planning had its impulse, by analogy, in particular, with the French Revolution, which brought a new concept of society, freeing itself from the shackles of feudalism. That is, if in feudalism there was a social commitment to collective participation, although without social mobility, now after the French Revolution this collective social commitment, characteristic of feudalism imposed by the Catholic Church, no longer exists, and bourgeois individualism emerges with great emphasis. This characteristic is directly reflected in music. As the author Bruno Kiefer reminds us in his work Elements of Musical Language, in a polyphonic plot, each voice is constrained by the others. The very character of polyphonic music makes impossible any vague individual expansion. The accompanied melody that appears already in the Baroque period is affirmation of the individual. The danger inherent in such a situation is obvious, a tendency toward pure exhibitionism, hollow virtuosity. In this sense, all musicians and artists in music have become hostages of this new logic that arose in those centuries, the logic of which we are still hostages in the 21st century. In the Renaissance, some treatises of music continued the Pythagorean concepts. Among them are Ugolino of Orvieto, lived between the 14th and 15th centuries. He was a composer, music theorist, cantor at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence and maestro di cappella at the Cathedral of Fiori. He presented his theory of music in the treatise Declaratio Musicae Disciplinae, recovering the Pythagorean conceptions of Boethius, and placed celestial music as the foundation of the nobility and excellence of music. Bartolomé Ramos de Pareja, he lived between the 15th and 16th centuries and was a mathematician, music theorist and composer. In 1482, when he published his Musica Practica, he revolutionarily proposed a new 5-boundary division of the monochord, breaking with the Pythagorean system that dominated the medieval ars antiqua through Boethius and Guido of Arezzo. This system of musical tuning produced consonantal perfect fourths and fifths, but the thirds and sixths were rough. The new division of Ramos de Pareja was gradually accepted. Francinus Gaffurius lived between the 15th and 16th centuries. He was an Italian musical theorist and composer. His most influential and famous contributions were the treatises Theoria Musicae and Practica Musicae. Possessed of a vast culture, he studied and transcribed many treatises of the time. Influenced by Pythagorean reasoning, he developed a kind of philosophy of music according to which the art of sounds is assimilated to the science of numbers and treated based on mathematical proportions, thus linking himself to the Pythagorean and Neoplatonic tradition that considered the harmony of sounds as the result of precise numerical relations. Francesco Giorgi, Italian Franciscan friar who lived between the 15th and 16th centuries, author of the work De Harmonia Mundi Totius of 1525. In this work, Giorgi proposed an idea of the universe created according to the universal system of proportion, which can be studied as laws of mathematics used by architects, thus fulfilling the tradition of Pythagorean reasoning. Heinrich Glerian lived between the 15th and 16th centuries. He was a music theorist, poet, musicologist, writer, university professor, mathematician, historian, musician, philosopher, geographer. His most famous work is the book Dodecakordon, published in 1547, is one of the most famous and influential Renaissance musical treatises. It covers topics of music theory, philosophy, and biographies, and includes more than 120 compositions by authors such as Josquin des Prés, Johannes Ockeghem. Organized in 3 parts, the work begins with a biographical study of Boethius. It includes a study in which he traces the origins, evolution, and use of musical modes in Cantican and monophony. The most significant aspect of Dodecakordon is the proposal of the existence of 12 modes, that is, 4 more modes in addition to the 8 modes already established since Pope Gregory in the 6th century. Then, the 4 additional modes included, in addition to the authentic and plagal modes since Pope Gregory, the Aeolian and Hypoaeolian modes and the Ionian and Hypojonian modes, thus following the logic of the previous authentic and plagal modes. These modes, Jonio and Aeolio, are equivalent to the major and minor scales, respectively, which will be basic in the tonal system to come. Glareno goes so far as to state that the Ionian mode was the most frequently used by composers of his time. Gioseffo Zarlino, he lived in the 16th century, and besides making a great contribution to the theory of counterpoint, he was one of the most important authors for the determination of the equal temperament of the scale used until today, which made the tonal musical system possible, and therefore the entire process of tonal musical composition that has existed in recent centuries, and still exists. His work La Institutione Harmonische of 1558 influenced all theoreticians after him. Zarlino was the first to theorize the primacy of the triad over the interval as a means of structuring harmony. His exposition of just intonation based on proportions within the scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is a departure from the Pythagorean diatonic system previously established and transmitted by Boethius. Vincenzo Galilei lived in the 16th century, in the Renaissance period of the first scientific revolution. Father of the famous scientist Galileo Galilei. Vincenzo was a polyphonist, lutenist, composer and music theorist. An important character for the music of our days, contributing significantly to the musical revolution that marks the beginning of the Baroque period. This period was the beacon for the development of Western music in the last centuries. Vincenzo participated in the Camerata Florentina group around 1580, led by Count Giovanni Bardi in Florence, the intellectual capital of the time. It was a group of humanists, musicians, poets and intellectuals who met to discuss and guide trends in the arts, especially in music and drama. The Camerata group was a watershed in the concepts of European music making that influenced all music in the West. The group proposed a revival of the Greek dramatic style. The Camerata's musical experiments led to the development of the recitative style. In this way, the studies and incentives of this group paved the way for the composition of dramatic music and the development of opera. Vincenzo in his study of pitch and string tension produced perhaps the first nonlinear mathematical description of a known natural phenomenon in history. It was an extension of a Pythagorean tradition, but went beyond it. Experts on the subject credit him with steering the activity of his son Galileo Galilei away from pure, abstract mathematics and toward experimentation using quantitative mathematical description of the results, a direction of importance to the history of physics and the natural sciences that predates Cartesianism. Vincenzo Galilei anticipated Bach's well-tempered harpsichord by promoting equal temperament. In his exploration of pitch and tonalities, he composed 24 groups of dances, clearly related to 12 major and 12 minor tonalities, 1584. Galilei made discoveries in acoustics, particularly involving the physics of vibrating strings and air columns. He found that while the proportion of an interval is proportional to the length of the strings, for example, a perfect fifth has the proportions of 3, 2, it varied with the square root of the applied tension, and the cube root of concave volumes of air. Suspended weights of equal length strings need to be in the ratio of 9:4 to produce the perfect fifth of 3:2. This work was carried forward by Marin Mersenne, who formulated the current law of vibrating strings. Some Pythagorean treatise writers of the Baroque period, 1600 to 1750. Johannes Kepler lived between the 16th and 17th centuries, astronomer, mathematician, astrologer, natural philosopher, and music writer. He is a key figure in the scientific revolution of the 17th century, best known for his laws of planetary motion and his books Astronomia Nova, Harmonice Mundi, Epitome Astronomiae Copernicani. This also served as the basis for Newton's theory of universal gravitation. In The Harmony of the World, Kepler discusses harmony and congruence in geometric shapes and physical phenomena. In this work he developed a theory in which he abandons the celestial harmonic relationships of Pythagorean tuning as the basis for musical consonance and the adoption of geometrically supported musical proportions. This turned out to be what allowed Kepler to relate musical consonance and the angular velocities of the planets. He divided the work into 5 long chapters. The third chapter deals with the origin of harmonic proportions in music. Robert Fludd. He lived between the 16th and 17th centuries. He was a physician, astrologer, musicologist, music theorist, mathematician, physicist, philosopher, cosmologist, Kabbalist, and Rose-Cross. He wrote several works. The Temple of Music is an important part of his main work, Metaphysical, Physical and Technical History of the Macrocosm and Microcosm. This treatise constitutes one of the pillars of musical theoretical knowledge that runs from its dawn in the Middle Ages to the end of the Renaissance. Marin Mersenne. He was a French polymath, priest, theologian, mathematician, music theorist, and philosopher who lived between the 16th and 17th century. He developed laws that describe the harmonics of a vibrating string, of a guitar or a piano. His most famous work is on music theory, Harmonie Universelle, for which he is referred to as the father of acoustics. This work was very important because it represented the most complete description of music theory for the time, mid-17th century. It covers various aspects of music, theoretical, practical, stylistic, organological, mathematical, acoustical, and theological, including the nature of sounds, movements, consonance, dissonance, genres, modes of composition, voice, singing, and all types of harmonic instruments. René Descartes, born in the late 16th century, he was a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist who invented analytic geometry, linking the previously separate fields of geometry and algebra. He is widely regarded as one of the founders of modern philosophy and algebraic geometry. Key figures in the scientific revolution. He laid the foundation for 17th century continental rationalism, later championed by Spinoza and Leibniz, and later resisted by the empiricist school of thought consisting of Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, influencing the entire field of rationalist thought that gave rise to much of today's practical reality. Along with other 17th century arch-rationalists such as Spinoza and Leibniz, they all gave the Age of Reason its names and its place in history. Descartes' works are well known and studied, but as a young man he wrote in 1618 the Compendium of Musicae, which was a treatise on musical theory and the aesthetics of music. And that definitely influenced and motivated Jean-Philippe Rameau 100 years later, to write his treatise on harmony, which is the father of the later harmony treatises, whose treatise defined everything we do to this day in our everyday Western musical practice. Athanasius Kircher lived in the 17th century and was a German Jesuit polymath who published some 40 important works in the fields of comparative religion, geology, and medicine. Kircher has been compared to Leonardo da Vinci for his enormous range of interests, and was honored with the title Master of 100 Arts. His work Musurgia Universalis, the universal musical art, of the great art of consonance and dissonance. Kircher compiled all the musical knowledge available in his time, making this work the first encyclopedia of music. Since its publication, it has been a valuable source of information for musicologists on the concepts of the Baroque style. It provides the earliest account of the doctrine of affections in music, whose theory of affections is a developing study in the academic world of music. Andreas Werkmeister lived in the 17th century and died in the early 18th century. He was a German organist, music theorist, and composer. One of the first advocates of equal temperament, and through this advocacy had great influence on the harmonic basis underlying almost all subsequent Western music. His works Musicae Mathematicae Hodigus Curiosus of 1687 and Musikalische Temperatur, Oder of 1691, described a system we would today call the good temperament, now known as the Werkmeister temperament. His idea, as well as that of other authors who were concerned with equal temperament, was basic for the creation of the tonal system that we still use today, although such a system has been exhausted since the late 19th century. Angelo Berardi, he was an Italian music theorist and composer who lived in the 17th century. He became known for his writings on music theory and counterpoint. Published in 1670 or 1681, has not survived, but is referred to in his Ragionamenti Musicali, 1681, which deals with the origins of music and the proliferation of musical styles. He wrote the work Musical Miscellany, which deals with examples and rules for counterpoint for music teachers. Eighteenth-century Illuminism and Romanticism in the music of the 19th century, some treatise writers influenced by Pythagoreanism between the years 1700 and 1900. Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton lived between the 17th and 18th centuries, was an English mathematician, physicist, astronomer, theologian, natural philosopher, and author who is widely recognized as one of the greatest and most influential mathematicians, physicists, and scientists of all time. He wrote several works in various fields of knowledge. He was a key figure in the Enlightenment philosophical revolution. Newton formulated the laws of motion and universal gravitation that formed the dominant scientific viewpoint until it was replaced by the theory of relativity proposed by Albert Einstein as early as the beginning of the 20th century. Newton equates the color spectrum of visible light with musical tones in his 1704 treatise Optics. Newton's musical circle of color was derived from the ancient Greek that colors, objects in the solar system, musical notes, and the days of the week are connected. Considering that the spectrum of tones defined by an octave is repeated several times within the range of human hearing, we see only one spectrum of light. Since red is the color of light with the lowest frequency visible to humans, Newton equates it to the tonic of a scale starting at D, Doric scale. Newton equates the other primary colors of yellow and blue with Fa and A, forming a minor triad. The tones B and E, forming semitones with the tones above them, are considered mixtures of the primary colors, being orange for E and blue-violet, indigo, for B. Jean-Philippe Rameau, he lived between the 17th and 18th centuries. He was one of the most important composers and theoreticians of 18th century French music. His most important work is the Treatise on Harmony, which became the first of the later treatises on harmony. Influenced by the work Compendio Musicae by René Descartes, Rameau establishes the idea of tonality by creating the concepts of tonic, subdominant, and dominant. Therefore, he was the pioneer of the harmonic functions from which functional harmony emerges. The treatise describes how to write music based on the tonal system used until today. It uses modern major and minor tonalities to teach readers what to do to get good music based on the 12-tone musical scale. The treatise is divided into 4 books. Book I, on the relationship between harmonic ratios and proportions. Book II, on the nature and properties of strings, and on everything that can be used to make perfect music. Book III, Principles of Composition. Book IV, Principles of Accompaniment. In this academic strand of Rameau, other authors continued his work in a historical sequence where each one of these authors took the baton from the other, being Gottfried Weber, lived between the 18th and 19th centuries, who continued Rameau's work by classifying the chords of the scale, ciphering them with Roman numerals, whose scheme is used until today. Hugo Riemann, who lived between the 19th and 20th centuries, using the theories of Rameau and Weber, established tonal dualism, a basic principle for understanding the harmonic functions, conceiving the triad, major and minor, as a unit provided by nature from the harmonic series in the Pythagorean vision. Simon Sector, who lived between the 18th and 19th centuries, and Anton Bruckner, Sector's contemporary, both created another conception, the monism, understanding that the triad is not a unit provided by nature, but a consequence of the third interval. Another author who continued on Rameau's historical path was Max Reger, who lived between the 19th and 20th centuries, and improved the dualistic system by conceiving the five tonal laws. And finally, Hermann Grabner, who simplified Riemann's system and established a more functional system that is still in use today. Giuseppe Tartini, he lived between the 17th and 18th century and was an Italian Baroque composer and violinist. Tartini was most interested in the theory of harmony and acoustics, and from 1750 until the end of his life he published several treatises, in which he also treated problems of music theory on a mathematical basis. He published his findings in a treatise Trattato di musica secondo la vera scienza dell'armonia. He is credited with the discovery of summation and difference tones, an acoustical phenomenon of particular utility on stringed instruments. Combination tone, also called resultant or subjective tone, is a psychoacoustic phenomenon of an additional tone or tones that are perceived artificially when two real tones are played at the same time. Albert F. von Thomas set a decisive course in the 19th century for establishing harmonics. He understood harmony as a theory of proportions based on numerical relationships and expressed in music, architecture, art, culture, etc. Music is based on numbers and their relations to each other. The same laws of music are also reflected in people and in the world. Through his research, von Thomas built a bridge that mediated between the 17th and 20th centuries. He understood his work as a reconstruction of the original Pythagorean wisdom. Many other authors are important, but the ones mentioned so far sufficiently represent this long Pythagorean tradition within music.